Adam,
Yes, Sam. Good morning.
good morning. It's pretty early here. Last week we talked about the history of Iran, and after hearing about that history up until 1979, can you sum it up in one sentence?
People want a piece of Iran.
That people do. Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we look at protests and revolutions, past and present, and use them to make sense of our world today. With me, as always, is the other half of the two nations that have ruined the world. Adam, my British friend, how are you today?
I'm not bad, but I think when we're talking about nations that have ruined the world, we shouldn't forget France. They'll feel so left
I
out.
think we give France too much credit in the world. Have they ruined West Africa? Yes. Have they ruined Southeast Asia? Yes. But,
Okay.
Canada rebounded.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah, how are you this week?
Yeah, doing good. I'm on vacation. I got 2 weeks. It's the Easter holidays, so I'm looking forward to some R&R.
That explains it. He's sleeveless today.
I am. You don't need to air my dirty laundry like that, but I am in a sleeveless shirt.
One day we will be a video podcast. One day. And then we can't hide.
True.
Since last we spoke, it's been about 2 weeks, making it about a month since the start of the conflict in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Last week I went to the No Kings protest in San Diego, which we've spoken about before, is quite interesting, especially given these times we currently live in. I have noticed that the younger crowd is a bit sparser at these No Kings protests lately. The older crowd is much the same in terms of these like intangible, very liberal signage. But the young people that are there, I have noticed more overtly leftist. I saw plenty of communist flags this time, which is very unheard of in America to be waving. Saw a lot of Palestine flags, even saw a couple of Iran flags. Yeah, what do you make of that?
I think that tracks. I imagine if you're sort of a run-of-the-mill younger lib, you both maybe have lost a bit of energy and also are feeling the pinch of the sort of, is it $7 a gallon gas now in the United States?
Ooh, approaching it here in California, for sure.
So I imagine you're feeling that pinch, and I imagine that if you were on the left track, then you've probably become even more galvanized in recent times. So I think that tracks. Is it encouraging? Hard to say. I think there needs to be a little more, maybe a bit more direction. Those protests are great, but their effectiveness at enacting change, I think, is slow, to say the least. And it seems like the opposition party, which isn't really an opposition party in the US, the Democratic Party, is doubling down once again on its left flank and trying to distance itself from that even further. An electoral strategy which has been an abject failure, and yet they can't quite seem to let go of.
They're like, what can we do? I think we just need to support Israel harder, don't we?
That does seem to be what they're about.
I had a conversation that made me be like, am I really having this conversation here and now? I was at a tent that was propped up by one of the many socialist groups there. That's the funny thing about America, is the leftists are very splintered and very idealistic at a time where I kind of think you just need to be pretty general.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to this group, and I believe it was the Socialist Alternative, that's their name. And I was like, so what's the difference between you guys and like those guys like across the way who are like another Marxist group, or like the DSA? Like, what's the difference with you guys? And they're like, well, we refuse to work with Democrats, so the DSA is out until then. I'm like, well, what's the difference between you and the 5 other socialist groups at this event? Like, well, for example, those guys over there are Marxist-Leninists. We're Trotskyists. So we can't work with them. They want a revolution now. We want reform within a socialist construct. And I'm like, oh my God, guys, can we just get out of the weeds for a second?
Yeah. Let's put that aside for one moment, and then we can argue afterwards. Like,
they all, of course, had a free newspaper.
Of course they did. Of course they did.
And when I would ask questions, they're like, why don't you take our newspaper? And I'm like, I did not bring a backpack. Do you have something that can fit in my pocket, please? But anyway, that was my update. And I suppose we'll go over this maybe at the end as well. But in the past 2 weeks, the conflict in Iran has only escalated. And despite the world sort of begging Trump to find an off-ramp, last time we spoke, an F-35 had been shot down. There was another fighter jet that was shot down yesterday.
Yeah, I saw that.
I don't know the classification of it, but I did see that an American soldier is presumed missing in Iran, which notoriously Trump does not like people that get taken prisoner. And two, Hegseth just yelled no quarter in a press conference this week. So I wonder what happens to your own troops when they require quarter.
Could you explain that phrase? I'm not familiar.
No quarter is an old-fashioned term in the military, basically saying we will take no prisoners.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
Like the quarter, of the ship is like.
Oh yeah.
It's
for
like
sure.
a hold.
Okay.
The Strait of Hormuz remains closed unless you're Chinese, basically. And
yeah.
Iran is coming out of this, despite the bombing across the country, which is obviously horrible. They're coming out of this quite well economically, as sanctions on their oil have been lifted by the United States to alleviate efforts for oil prices. Which seems counterproductive, right?
Well, Iran is absolutely winning this conflict so far. I mean, the destruction of the country is atrocious, but they have stated, I believe, that they will allow the passage, or they're considering allowing the passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, even if they're European or North American, if they will accept payment for oil in Chinese yuan rather than the American dollar. And that really will be catastrophic for the US's place in the world, even more so than everything Trump's done already.
For those that don't know, basically the reason the US can take on trillions in debt and, has been able to maintain itself as the world power is because of the petrodollar, right?
Yeah. One of the reasons, yeah.
Because right now, every barrel of oil in the world up until now is bought with the US dollar, per global economic policy.
Which means that every country has to have a large supply of dollars in order to buy oil with, and that means that it's always in demand and that the price is pretty high, and that sort of subsidizes, it brings foreign capital into the United States, which the government can spend on, well, in theory, Social Security and Medicaid, but in practice, weapons and tax cuts for the rich, and it also adds stability to the dollar because of this sort of global demand for it. And Iran is threatening that system. And this actually threat that was made previously, that was part of, many people believe the main reason why Iraq was invaded in 2003, because Saddam Hussein said he was going to accept oil payments in euros.
An allied currency.
Yeah, exactly. And that was unacceptable to the United States.
This really is signaling a shift in the world order if this yuan-dominated oil market is ever put in place. But that's been one of the dominoes to fall. Once again, China wins by doing nothing.
Yeah.
Well, not exactly nothing, because today we'll maybe come to understand why their relationship with Iran is so close and how that happened. And we'll be covering the history of Iran from the revolution until today, leading up to this war. Last episode, we covered basically ancient history all the way up till 1979. Adam, do you remember why the Iranians were protesting in 1979? It's been about 2 weeks since we spoke about this.
In 1979, it was because the British and Americans had overthrown the democratically elected government in Iran because they wanted to nationalize Iran's oil and installed a very authoritarian regime, the Pahlavi monarchy. But the actual trigger in 1979, I don't recall what that was. No, please refresh my memory.
Yeah, let's go over it, because last episode we were following as Khomeini. Do you remember who he was?
Yes, he was the first supreme leader of Iran after the 79 revolution.
But before that, he was just a cleric,
right.
A very popular cleric, and one that had been exiled for speaking out against the Shah. So we concluded last episode with him arriving back in Tehran on February 1st, 1979, 2 weeks after the Shah and his family had fled the country. Khomeini had been giving interviews. First he was in Iraq, but then his exile moved him to Paris, and he became very, very popular, increasingly popular in his exile. He gave 130 interviews in 1978 from his exile in Paris, and these made their way back into Iran via tapes. Let's recap. So Iran, it's a thousands-year-old civilization of continuous history. It spent the 19th century caught between British and Russian ambitions, and that dynamic was sealed in 1908 when the British discovered oil there and proceeded to take most of the profits. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized the oil industry. So that's what you were referring to. And they installed the young Shah as a reliable Western client. The Shah ruled for decades with brutal repression from his secret police, known as SAVAK, backed by the US and by Israel. This acted as a US proxy to the region. He forced through rapid westernization that enriched the elite mostly, flooded Tehran with foreign culture, and crushed traditional society, while his secret police tortured and killed dissidents. So by the late 1970s, massive inflation, corruption, and cultural resentment had created a tinderbox. And in January 1978, the protests were sparked by government newspapers verbally attacking Ayatollah Khomeini. This set off 40-day cycles of mourning after protesters were killed, and each 40 days there'd be new, larger protests, and these essentially paralyzed the country. So by January 1979, the Shah, who was ill with cancer, fled Iran forever. And that brings us to the moment we paused. February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to a warm welcome of millions of people, and we pick up the story there. Khomeini quickly appoints a provisional government, and within weeks, the old regime and its structure collapses. But how was he able to do this so quickly? It can be attributed to the nature of the revolution. As we stated last episode, the revolution was not just Islamists, it was a coalition. There were leftists, nationalists, street merchants, students, clerics, all united against the common enemy of the Shah. But what set Khomeini apart was that his network was the best organized. They had the mosques, which was historically a structure that the state couldn't really penetrate, and they had all these seeds planted from cassette tapes that had been smuggled in about Khomeini's speeches, his interviews, and they had a simple message, which is that Islam is the solution to our problems. There was a key concept that was developing around this time. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Velayat-e-Faqih, which means the guardianship of the jurists. This was a radical new idea in Shia Islam, meaning that clerics should rule, not just advise. So back in the dynastic days of the past, powerful clerics did have roles in ruling the country, but it was mainly to advise the king, the Shah, on their matters. In this new setup, the Islamic jurists would have the ultimate authority over the state and society, and this was largely innovated by Khomeini himself, and it transforms Shia politics across the region. At this time, we're going to keep checking in on the minority groups, mainly the Kurds because they're the largest minority group, but also Arabs and Baluchs kind of fall under this umbrella. They initially support the revolution because they're hoping for more autonomy and recognition, but they will be disappointed. On April 1st, 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran is declared. There's a referendum where 98% vote yes, but it was a yes-no question on do you want an Islamic Republic, and there was no alternative. Because of this wording, a lot of Sunni minorities, mostly Kurds and Baluchs, boycott this referendum, but nonetheless, the Islamic Republic is declared. Previously, we spoke about Iran's relationship with Israel as a U.S. proxy. They were the best of friends, basically, up until 1979. Immediately, the new regime cuts all ties with their former close ally. The Israeli embassy in Tehran is closed and handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. Khomeini coins the terms Little Satan to refer to Israel and Great Satan to refer to America. Britain gets off scot-free. I don't know why.
It's a fading power at this point.
Now, why turn on Israel? Well, there's ideological and material reasons for this. The ideological being that the Islamist worldview sees Palestine as Islamic land and Israel as a usurper. The geopolitical is that aligning with Palestinian causes gives Iran legitimacy in the Arab and Muslim world. And strategic, Israel was the Shah's ally, America's ally, and enmity to Israel is enmity to the old regime and the Western imperialism it represented. This is a complete reversal of that 30-year alliance. Iranian Jews who had flourished under the Shah now face suspicion, and most of them leave the country. And initially, some Arab regimes, like the Assads in Syria, see an opportunity, and Syria becomes Iran's only Arab ally, because both oppose Iraq's Saddam Hussein, and both oppose Israel and U.S. hegemony. This alliance with Syria lasted up until very recently.
Yeah, last year, or December 24, I guess, right?
Yeah, so up until then, they were largely Iran's most loyal ally in the Middle East. Adam, Israel went from ally to little Satan literally overnight. So what do you think of Iran's strategy here?
I suppose there are two things that come to mind there. One is appealing to an internal audience, the sort of home front, where they're trying to say, look, this country has been completely failed by appealing to the United States and their proxy in the Middle East, Israel. Trust us, we're going to steer you away from these external influences and lead in sort of a new age. I suppose the other factor is this is 79, so we're still in a time of great powers. Leftists supported the Islamist cause, and I guess that means cozying up to the Soviet Union a little bit more.
Potentially. We'll see how those interests align.
Okay.
But yeah, I do think that posing yourself against Zionism in this time and today is an anti-imperialist statement. So
yeah,
trying to sway influence over the rest of the Muslim world, I think, was their cause. Now we'll keep checking in on Iran's relationship with Israel, because that's obviously why we're talking about Iran today, is because Israel started this war.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at that relationship and how it got to this point. But one famous event that happened was November 4th, 1979, the hostage crisis.
Yeah.
So the exiled Shah, he kind of bounces from country to country for a while, ends up in the Western Hemisphere, ends up in the Caribbean, but ultimately is trying to get into the U.S. for cancer treatment, to which he is allowed in October of 1979. Iranian students, calling themselves Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on November 4th. They take 66 American hostages, and their demand is to send the Shah back to Iran for trial. Initially, Khomeini didn't know about this, but within days he embraces it. It's a perfect tool to consolidate his power and crush the moderates in his government. At this point, the provisional government resigns, and sort of the permanent structure goes from here on out. These Americans are held hostage for 444 days, and the hostages become nightly TV drama in America. There was a show called America Held Hostage that would air every night. That eventually became Nightline, which is a famous news program. This humiliation is really seared into American memory. Even now, like, I spoke to a friend about this conflict. I know he has a quite conservative military father. And I asked what his dad thought about all of this, with his dad being a bit more logistical militarily than the Trump administration. And he said his dad was all for it. And I was like, why? And he said, well, payback for the hostages.
Wow.
That's a core memory here for a lot of Americans. I mean, it led, some say the sweeping election of Reagan was due to Jimmy Carter's failure to negotiate these hostages while being president.
That's the movie Argo, right? Was about this.
The movie Argo is about that, and if you watch it without context, it's very a little confusing, because you're like, they don't explain why the Iranians are storming the embassy too much, and then you might be in your head being like, well, why are the Canadians operating normally?
Yeah, I did have that, because I was maybe like 15 when I saw that movie.
Yeah, me too.
So I lacked all of that context. But it was pointed out to me that at the end of the movie, when they're on the plane and they say, we're now leaving Iranian airspace. You're free to order alcoholic drinks, and everyone cheers. No one else on that plane knew that they were freed hostages, and so thought they were just very enthusiastic alcoholics.
I mean, that whole movie is only about like 8 hostages escaping, right? The other, 60 were still there. So.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even clock that. Huh.
So the rest had to be negotiated out, basically. But yeah, it took 444 days. For Iranians, this embassy became, quote, the den of spies because, they rifled through all the documents and published them. It revealed CIA contacts and plotting within the country. So Iran felt victimized by this as well, and it strained relations further with the United States. Now, 1979, as you can imagine, with a big revolution, the area becomes quite unstable because there's power vacuums that people are trying to fill. Now, Christmas of 1979, December 25th, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. This was notoriously their quagmire in the Middle East, but Iran doesn't like this. Like, we were talking about Soviet alignments, but Iran sees this as another incursion of the Russian Empire into their space, especially because a lot of this former territory in Iran was historically part of these like Persian empires in the past. Mm-hmm. And to the Ayatollah, communism is a big threat to him as well, right? The leftists were quickly purged out of his government and out of the movement because they wanted to organize in a different structure than a theocracy.
There were when I lived in the Netherlands and attended this storytelling event that was founded by a guy. I don't remember if he was born in the Netherlands, but if he wasn't, then he went to the Netherlands very young because his parents fled Iran because they were communists and they were it wasn't safe for them after the revolution for these reasons.
I love meeting old communists in the West.
Oh, yeah.
I think I've told you about my old professor from Greece who, like, his parents were communists in the Civil War, and it's very hush-hush about, like, if you meet, like, Greek Americans, like, I kind of contribute when you listen to comedian Stavros Halkias, and when he tries to be very silly, but then when someone brings up, like, a really stupid political take within that comedy world, he'll check them real quick with some facts, and it's because he's got, like, all these old communist Greeks back in Baltimore that have been in his ear his whole life,
Yeah.
Back to Iran. Like I said, they were not thrilled about this Soviet incursion either, but for the U.S., this looks like a crescent of crisis, like radical Islam on the march, Soviet expansion, America's key ally gone, hostages held, oil prices spiking. And for Iran, the new regime is immediately isolated. It's got hostile neighbors, to the west, to the north. They feel like they will soon be attacked. Quickly checking up on the Kurds in 1979, they immediately after the revolution demanded autonomy for their region. They take control of several cities in that Kurdish region, but the new regime sends the Revolutionary Guards to crush the uprising. There's heavy fighting, thousands killed, and it creates a lasting wound. Many Kurds see the Islamic Republic as just as oppressive as the Shah, but the new regime also views the Kurds now and autonomous demands as a foreign plot to dismember the country. And they're not like entirely wrong because Iraq, Israel, and the US were all funneling weapons and money into the Kurds there and continue to do so for a long time. Now, moving into the next decade, in 1980, Iraq's Saddam Hussein, backed by the US. Yes, I said that correctly to those of you that are not super familiar with modern Middle Eastern history. Yes, Saddam Hussein was backed by the US, as well as a few other groups they end up fighting later on, also backed by the US. Pay attention to who the US is backing at any given point in that area. But he invades Iran. He fears that the revolution will inspire the Shia majority in Iraq, and the US provides intelligence and dual-use technology. And the Soviet Union also backs Iraq, though they arm both sides. And the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, pour, and yes, I did say that correctly, Kuwait, pour billions into Saddam's war, and they see Iran as the bigger threat. Israel's role in this is that they secretly sell weapons to Iran during this war. This kind of sparks the Iran-Contra affair, but despite the rhetoric that Israel has for Iran, realpolitik wins. Like, Israel sees Iran as a useful counterweight to Iraq, who is a closer enemy neighbor, right? Adam, do you know what the Iran-Contra affair is?
I don't know. It's a term that I've heard, but I don't know what it is.
We're not going to dive too deep because it doesn't affect the larger story too much. Maybe an episode is due one day, but every time I try to dive into it, it's very confusing. There are so many things at play that are seemingly unrelated, but it was a secret Reagan administration operation selling weapons to Iran in violation of their own arms embargo on Iran to secure the release of U.S. hostages in Lebanon, then illegally diverting the profits to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua after Congress had banned aid to those rebels.
Yes, I had heard about this because I thought the Contras were to do with Latin America. This is also when the CIA got involved in smuggling drugs into the United States in order to pay for those same weapons.
Yes, they were also funneling drugs into America's poorer communities to make money to raise for this project.
Yeah, I spoke to I remember speaking to a friend of mine years ago about this thing, and she's a Latin American scholar. She's lived in Honduras on and off for years. Honduras was one of the areas where the CIA was quite active in sort of smuggling drugs through. And I said to her, something I don't get about this with the CIA smuggling drugs into the States and then spending the money on weapons. Were they doing this for like ideological reasons or to line their own pockets, or what was it? And she goes, no, I don't really know, and neither does anyone else.
Yeah. This is the extent we're talking about it, but then we're stopping here because it's one of the most confusing events in modern history.
One day there'll be a huge data dump and all of these files will come out and someone will write an amazing book about it. But
yeah. Hopefully. But anyway, the whole crux of this is this invasion of Iran from Iraq. And this war is brutal. I think this is potentially one of the most brutal conflicts in the last 70 years, the Iran-Iraq War. This lasted 8 years, from 1980 to 1988, and it's estimated 500,000 to 1 million died on this front. It wasn't total warfare, it was very concentrated on the border regions. There was trench warfare, chemical weapons, human waves attack, just like World War I, basically.
Wow.
There were even children sent to clear the minefields. It was brutal. And during this conflict, despite selling weapons to Iran, the U.S. tilts towards Iraq. The Reagan administration removes Iraq from the terrorism list. And in 1988, a U.S. warship shoots down Iran Flight 655, killing 290 civilians. Washington expresses regret, but no apology. Now, this war, much like World War I, there was no ultimate point and eventually ends with just a stalemate. But during this, it gave rise to Iran's axis of resistance, which still exists today. So in 1982, Israel invaded its neighbor Lebanon with the aim of expelling the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was operating from there. But Iran sees this as an opportunity, so it sends Revolutionary Guard forces to back Lebanon in their fight in the south. They help establish Hezbollah, aka the Party of God, which was the Lebanese Shia militia within the country, and is modeled after Iran's own Revolutionary Guard. Hezbollah becomes the first and most successful of Iran's proxy forces, and it fights Israel to a stalemate in Lebanon a few times, actually, 1985, 2000, 2006. And this is the beginning of that axis of resistance, and this is a network of allied forces, Hezbollah in Lebanon, later Hamas in Palestine, Shia militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen. Most of them are Shia, not all. Hamas and Palestine are not, but they're all united in opposition to the US and Israel. Mm-hmm. Syria becomes a crucial land bridge for Iranian support for Hezbollah, and the Syria-Iran axis solidifies. Despite Syria being pretty secular in policy, and Iran being Islamist, they're united in their shared enemies. Adding Iraq to that list as well. Syria was not fond of Iraq. This war between Iran and Iraq, there were no winners really, but it did let Khomeini crush his internal opponents. Leftists, moderates, even some clerics are sidelined or executed. And the Revolutionary Guard, or the IRGC, you might be hearing that in the news lately, becomes a massive economic and military force within Iran, much like the U.S. military is here. They control vast sections of the economy. At this point, they start developing a missile program in Iran.
I want to just have a moment there to talk about the IRGC, because as I understand it, I saw an interview with, I can't remember who, but some Iran scholar who was talking about the IRGC and how you sort of have to understand how they function in the West. Because if you take like Donald Trump's view of power, it seems that Donald Trump thinks that power is vested in powerful, charismatic individuals, and that by taking out Ayatollah Khomeini or leadership or whatever, that is cutting off the source of power, as it were. But the IRGC functions a little bit like it's this sort of totalizing body, as I understand it, that would be analogous to an organization that includes the CIA, the FBI, the army, the mafia, and the treasury, or something like that, and it has this vast swathe of control over the both the economics and the politics and the security and also the black market of Iran.
Pretty much, yeah. All encompassing, essentially, within their economy and within their daily life. And there's no checks, like you said, there's no separation of powers within it, but it is widely pretty autonomous. Like it's not super hierarchical in a sense, especially during defense time. But yeah, good points. Now, in 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini dies. He's very old at this point. He's 89 years old. And confusingly, a man named Ali Khamenei is chosen to become supreme leader. Their names are so similar that before I actually studied Iranian history, I thought they was just the same dude the whole time. So the old one is Khomeini, the new one is Khamenei. He was still in power until last month, right, when he was killed in these current strikes. He was a mid-ranking cleric with strong political connections to the IRGC, and he was chosen instead of a powerful cleric because he was politically convenient for the IRGC and the structures that be, and he would hold the regime together in the structure it had developed. Now, at the point of Khomeini's death, let's check in on the relationships with some of its neighbors. During the war, Iran bought weapons from the USSR, North Korea, China, and these relationships still continue to this day. Obviously, Russia replacing the USSR in that equation. And their relationship with China is fairly minimal apart from buying those weapons, but China becomes a buyer of Iranian oil and a supplier of cheap goods. So that's the foundation of their close economic relationship today. Let's kind of speed towards the modern day a little bit. We're in the 90s. There's a dual containment policy under Bill Clinton, meaning the U.S. is trying to keep both Iran and Iraq isolated. Sanctions tighten on both countries, but Iran's economy diversifies and tries to attract foreign investment. In 1991, the Gulf War happens, where U.S. destroys Iraq's army, and this in turn means Iran's close enemy is weakened. But the U.S. also permanently stations troops in Saudi Arabia from this point on, so give and take in that situation for Iran. Now, at the end of that decade in the 90s, a reformist president was elected in Iran. He calls for dialogue of civilizations, and there's some thaw with Europe there, but the U.S. remains hostile. But Khamenei kind of blocks any major reforms. And in this structure, I just want to clarify that Iran do elect their president, but he is a subordinate to the Ayatollah.
Okay.
So like today, they still have, like they have a president right now, like
Yeah.
He wasn't killed, but he's not the highest guy in the government. Europe is engaging more with Iran at this point. Trade is increasing, there's diplomatic visits, but Europe ultimately follows the US lead on sanctions. And the 90s are a serious low point for their relationship with Russia because Russia is kind of dealing with its own problems at that point, the fall of the Soviet Union and the chaos afterwards. But both oppose US hegemony, so quiet cooperation continues between them. And another result of that Gulf War in 91 is that Iraqi Kurds gained autonomy under US protection, and this inspires Iranian Kurds and worries Tehran, which causes them to crack down even more on Kurdish political activity. Now, Iran's nuclear program actually didn't begin in recent times. It began under the Shah with US help. It was a program called Atoms for Peace, ATOMS. I know my California accent, you can't differentiate between your name and the word atom.
Yeah, science class in an American school was a nightmare.
Yeah. But after the revolution, this program was suspended, obviously.
That sounds so like, I know it's like a little bit later than that, but it sounds so 1950s. Where it's like, behold, atomic energy as a way into the future, building peace across the Middle East. The hydrogen bomb.
Behold. Behold the power. Yeah. This is revealed in 2002 when a dissident group within Iran reveals their undeclared nuclear facilities at Natanz and Arak, A-R-A-K, which sparks an international crisis. Adam, why would Iran want nuclear weapons?
Oh, well, leverage, I suppose, is the answer. As recent events have shown, I think we've seen with the classic example is North Korea. If you have a nuclear weapon, you don't get fucked with as much. You know?
Absolutely.
Like, it is, if the US is putting a lot of pressure on you, and you're a smaller economy and you're a smaller army, as everywhere in the world is, then having a nuclear weapon is a pretty good way to make sure they don't fuck with you too much.
100%. And as always, let's look at the material answers here. Let's look at the neighborhood they reside in. Israel has nukes, though undeclared, still. Yeah, speaking of being mad at hidden developments, right? Pakistan, at this point, also has nukes. India has nukes. The U.S., obviously. And Iraq claimed to, or at least was blamed to have them before the 2003 invasion. And as you said, North Korea, they got him. And there's no war in Korea at the moment.
Yeah.
Basically, the lesson here is that nuclear weapons are the only guarantee of sovereignty against a U.S.-backed threat.
Which is horrifying, but is something history has shown to be accurate.
And famously, in 2002, George Bush names Iran part of the axis of evil alongside two other nations. Do you remember what those are?
I don't. I know Iran.
This is a pub
Iran was
quiz
the big
question.
one.
This is like name two of the three of the axis of evil.
No, go on, tell me.
Iraq, who notoriously Iran hates.
Yeah.
And North Korea.
Okay.
And in 2003, the U.S. invades Iraq. They topple Saddam Hussein. Now, Iran's two biggest enemies are both engaged and being removed by the U.S., those two being Saddam Hussein and the Taliban in Afghanistan, who are Sunni extremists, so they stand ideologically opposed to Iran. At this stage, it seems like there is a missed opportunity because Iran reportedly offers a grand bargain, quote unquote, to the U.S. via a Swiss ambassador. Talks on everything. Nuclear program, withdrawing support for Hamas and Hezbollah, accepting a two-state solution with Israel, but the Bush administration reportedly ignores it. Iran sees that Saddam Hussein, who actually had no WMDs, got invaded, and they draw the obvious conclusion we've been talking about. And at this point, too, Iraq's Shia majority that we've discussed, they come to power through U.S.-sponsored elections, ironically, and they become closely allied with Iran. So Iran's influence in Iraq explodes at this point. Good job, USA, right?
Yeah. So talk me through, because there's a lot going on in this area of history. So the link between Iran's increase in influence in Iraq and the development of their nuclear program, are these just sort of happening at the same time, or is there a direct link?
There's a direct link because Hussein fell without having nukes. So they see this as like confirmation bias of the U.S. will invade you if you don't have nukes. And the Shia majority taking power in Iraq is a direct result of that as well. So happening in the same scenario, not necessarily A plus B.
Right, sure.
Now this period of desired openness towards the world kind of comes to an end at this point. There's a hardliner president that's elected. Can you pronounce the name of the person elected in 2005?
Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
So he is a Holocaust denier. He's anti-Israeli in the hardest sense, and the rhetoric escalates. He says Israel must be wiped off the map, and Israel now openly discuss military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities with U.S. backing. This is all the way back in 2005. In 2006, Hezbollah and Israel go to war. 34 days of fighting. Hezbollah survives and claims victory because of this. And it kind of is proving Iran's proxy strategy as being successful. even when they're not directly in conflict with another country. From here until the Obama negotiations, it's kind of a shadow war. In 2010, there is a cyber weapon attributed to US and Israel that attacks an enrichment facility in Iran and destroys 10% of their centrifuges. From 2010 to 2012, there's a series of assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists by Mossad, which is the Israeli CIA, basically. These are done with like motorcycle hit squads, car bombs, and then magnetic bombs attached to the cars. But in response, Iran accelerates the program, and they move the facilities deeper underground.
I think it's also worth mentioning that Iran denies trying to build a nuclear bomb. I think they were. I think they were trying to build nuclear weapons, but it is worth noting they deny trying to do that and that their nuclear program was for civilian power generation.
And Israel denies these assassinations too, but we're a materialist podcast.
Yeah.
At this time, Israel reportedly practices long-range strikes, including over the Mediterranean, with U.S. refueling and intelligence. But China is making itself known on the world stage. Like 2008 famously was a big year for them.
Yeah, the Olympics.
They become Iran's top oil customer, and Russia sells Iran advanced air systems. S-300 anti-air system was delivered in 2016, and this solidifies Iran's eastern pivot. Early 2000s, they were trying to appeal to Europe. That didn't work, so now they pivot to China and Russia. Now in 2013, the moderate Hassan Rouhani is elected as president. He ran on a platform of ending isolation for Iran, fixing the economy, and secret talks with the U.S. begin in Oman. In November 2013, an interim deal is put in place with the U.S., and Iran freezes their nuclear program for limited sanctions relief. And in July 14th, 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, is signed. This is the Iran nuclear deal that you hear Trump say, all these people talk about. This is that deal. Iran limits their enrichment to 3.67%, which is far below weapons grade. They reduce centrifuges by 2/3. They redesign their reactors, and they allow very transparent inspections by the UN, regular inspections. At this point, the US, the EU, and the UN lift many of their sanctions, though the US still keeps some. And the US, UK, France, Russia, China, and Germany all sign this agreement. When I say that the US left some sanctions, I mean that the US banks still block transactions in the country, and investments kind of lag because of this. But still, Iran's economy is rebounding.
I mean, that's a pretty big sanction left in place.
It is. But that means they can operate through European banks, so European companies rush back in. Airbus, Total, Peugeot, they all signed deals to establish themselves in the country. Europe becomes very invested in this nuclear deal's success. However, there is a dissident. There is someone crying out against this. Can you guess who is the largest opponent of this deal?
It's either going to be Donald Trump or the nation of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, Netanyahu's in charge, so we can even say him.
Bibi Netanyahu, yeah.
And he fights this deal relentlessly. He actually addresses U.S. Congress in March 2015 without White House invitation, which is a huge breach of protocol before that. And he argues that the deal will enable Iran's nuclear program, not stop it.
How did he get to speak to Congress if the White House didn't invite him?
Congressional invitation by Republicans.
Oh, okay. Huh.
Who controlled the House at the time.
I see. Wow. I thought you meant he just rocked up.
He did.
Uh-huh.
In as much of a way you can rock up in that situation. It would kind of be like Nigel Farage just inviting, Netanyahu.
Right. Sure.
But anyway, Netanyahu argues that the sunset clauses on this agreement, which some restrictions expire after 10 to 15 years, mean that Iran will get a path to a bomb eventually. But Iran's argument is that they never wanted a bomb, and the deal proves that. The deal passes over Israel's objections, but Netanyahu's relationship with Republicans deepens, and he's working the U.S. political system to maintain U.S.-Israel close ties. And this is something we're seeing the fruits of today, right? The Arab states in the Gulf were initially hostile to the deal, like Saudi, UAE. They saw Iran as a threat, but they also see the US's commitment to the region waning at this point around 2015. So they begin to hedge. They engage with China. They diversify their investments, their alliances. But then Donald Trump is elected in 2016. He, in May 2018, unilaterally withdraws from the JCPOA, calls it, quote, the worst deal ever, and reimposes harsh sanctions, including secondary sanctions on any company doing business with Iran. Europe tries to keep the deal alive, but the US banking system is too powerful. So all these companies from Europe that had invested and moved into Iran now have to flee. Just showing the autonomy of Europe, really.
The non-existent autonomy of Europe.
You feel free until you reach the end of your lead, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Iran waits a year, then they gradually exceed enrichment limits of that deal. By 2021, Iran has 20% enriched uranium, then 60%. Weapons grade is 90%. And we begin this downward spiral. More sanctions, more enrichment, more tension. The relationship with Europe collapses. Europeans are angry at the US, but can't defy Washington. But Iran feels betrayed by Europe's inability to deliver economic benefits. They just see them as US puppets in this case. And of course, Netanyahu in Israel publicly cheers for Trump's withdrawal. Israel is seen as the power behind this decision. Now, the first time this conflict gets hot is January 3rd, 2020. US drones strike at Baghdad airport, killing General Qasem Soleimani. He was the head of IRGC's Quds force, and Soleimani was the architect of Iran's regional strategy. A national hero to many, but head of the terrorist list to the US. Iran retaliates with missile strikes on US bases in Iraq, and before this gets too hot, both sides step back, but the taboo on direct strikes is broken from this point on. Trump had a maximum pressure campaign during his first term to strangle Iran's economy, like thinking what he's doing to like Cuba right now. Oil exports dropped from 2.5 million barrels a day to under 200,000, and inflation soars in Iran. Unemployment spikes, protests erupt. In November 2019, gasoline price hikes led to protests, which led to hundreds killed, according to Amnesty International. And Iran has stopped allowing the UN to inspect their nuclear program. At this point, Israel began ramping up their strikes in Syria, which also affected Iran's proxies with Hezbollah. But China sees an opportunity. They sign a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement in 2021, which includes massive investments in energy, infrastructure, and security operations. Iran officially becomes a key node in the Belt and Road Initiative from China. And after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's relationship with Iran tightens. Military cooperation grows, and Iran supplies drones to Russia for the Ukraine war. Now, Adam, Trump pulled out of this deal that was working. The UN verified Iran's compliance 15 times. My question to you is why?
I believe because it was one of the big successes of the Obama administration from a foreign policy perspective, and he couldn't stand that. I don't think it's much more complicated than that. I think he's a narcissist and wanted to undo one of Obama's big successes. I suppose the other thing is that this deal was not favored by Israel because Israel views the mere existence of Iran as an existential threat. And so Trump had people whispering in his ear about that from Israel as well. In many cases, not whispering, telling him that this was a bad deal and that he could do better. I certainly think that Netanyahu knows how to handle Trump to get what he wants. And I think those are the two main reasons, really. I think there's an idea that a lack of hard force victory as well makes America look weak. I think that's something that Trump believes. And so at the end of the day, I think it's about wanting to show American force projection and be seen as the guy to do it rather than Barack Obama.
Yeah, I think sadly you're right. There was a key point that I think a lot of our contemporary history will look back on, and that's October 7th, 2023.
Yeah.
When Hamas attacked Israel. And Iran celebrated the attack but denies direct involvement, though, again, Hamas is part of that axis of resistance that receives funding, weapons, and training from Iran. And Israel's assault on Gaza begins after that. This led to largely increased regional escalation. Hezbollah begins firing into Israel. Houthis attack Red Sea shipping. and Iran-backed militias strike U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. This is the unity of fronts that Iran has of pressuring the Americans and Israelis in the area. And this also tests the new relationships that they've established with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, and Qatar. But ultimately, all these countries are just hedging. Like, no one wants full war, no one wants to denounce anyone. But on April 1st, 2024, now this was under Biden, Israel strikes the Iranian consulate in Damascus and kills several IRGC commanders. As a response, Iran launches unprecedented direct strikes on Israel. Over 300 drones and missiles go in on April 13th, 2024. Most are intercepted by Israel, the US, Jordan, and the UK, but it is the first time Iran directly strikes Israel from its territory. Israel then retaliates by strikes near Isfahan, which is their nuclear facility. Both signal that they want de-escalation, but the precedent there is set. The precedent there is also set for Jordan, which sits in the middle of them, where it'll intercept missiles for Israel. But Jordan also faces domestic protests over Gaza, so they're walking a tightrope. Russia and China call for restraint. Neither side wants war, but both blame the US for provoking. This brings us to last year. June 2025, Israel launches Operation Rising Lion. Large-scale strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities in Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. They strike military bases, and they target senior commanders. Confirmed deaths include senior IRGC leadership and nuclear scientists. As you said, Israel sees Iran as an existential threat, and Netanyahu doubles down on all this, saying it's time to cut off the head of the snake. But the U.S. denies direct involvement in this. Late last year, in 2025, massive protests erupt in Iran over economic grievances, strict religious enforcement, and just repression in general, combined with the material conditions that have been degrading for a long time due to U.S. sanctions. So there's a bloody crackdown in response to this. Which brings us to this year. And we know the story from here. The U.S. sending an armada to the Gulf. There's indirect talks in Oman that fail. February 28th, 2026, Operation Epic Fury begins, which is the stupid quagmire we're in today, right?
Yeah.
And we know what's been going on. Let's just look at the material questions, the material points of this war, and we'll wrap up from here. One, I think it's important to point out Iran is not Iraq.
You don't mean this in a George Bush way.
No, I don't. Iraq was an artificial state. It was created by Britain after World War I with deep ethnic and sectarian divisions. It had no real national army after 2003, but in contrast, Iran has 2,500 years of continuous national identity. It's got a professional army and a population that generally resists foreign invaders. Iran's minorities have grievances, but they also remember being used as pawns by outside powers. The regime spent 45 years integrating them through patronage and repression. Second point, the regime change fantasy ignores history. The only reason the Shah lasted as long as he did was brutal repression backed by the US, and once that was gone, the regime collapsed. A US-installed dictator would have zero legitimacy. Reza Pahlavi, who I believe today made a statement about rethinking this war.
Really?
Yeah. Reza Pahlavi, the Shah's son, who lives in Maryland, he wouldn't last a week in Iran. The moderate opposition was crushed years ago, and any new leaders would just be seen as a U.S. puppet. And we can look at Iraq and Afghanistan. Billions spent, thousands dead, and what's left? Third is the cost to the U.S. The first 100 hours of this conflict cost $3.7 billion. Oil prices are at over $110 a barrel. And we know that Trump's base hates high gas prices, right?
Oh, yeah.
So this can't sustain for long. The U.S. also has no budget for this. This was not authorized by Congress. Every dollar is borrowed. They just announced also that he wants to cut Medicaid in general to fund this. He's saying it's not the federal government's job to provide health care, but it is the federal government's job to fight wars. The Pentagon's unlimited munitions production is great for shareholders, but terrible for everyone else. And as we know, this is a strategic gift to rivals. Every ally of the U.S. other than Israel feels blindsided by this. U.S. influence wanes. Well, Russia gets to sell more oil to China and India at higher prices. China watches the U.S. get bogged down in another war. And even Iran is making a lot of money on oil now.
Yeah.
China does nothing and it wins, as always.
I have a website open called militaryspend.org, which has a live tracker of the estimated cost of the US involvement in Iran.
Do tell.
Well, it's going up at 10. It refreshes every second, and it goes up $10,300 every second for $890 million per day, approximately. Currently sitting at $31.7 billion.
A teacher's salary is starting as like 40 grand, right?
Yeah, so in like 4 seconds, it's spent what a teacher makes in a year. Over the course of this podcast, around $40 million will have been spent.
Just shows how long-winded I am. But, I mean, the blowback to this will be immense. I mean, it does nothing but strengthen Iranian resolve, right? It unites the country. And it poses the Israel question in the United States, like who pushed for this war. It's become very apparent the control that the state of Israel has over, at the very least, the Republicans in America, but we all know both parties in America. This was very, very clearly their war, right? Now, looking from a materialist standpoint, Adam, who actually wins from this war? Like, is it the US, Israel? Does no one win? Is it just weapons manufacturers? Just China? Just Russia? I mean, like, the Ukraine war is over now, basically, right? Is this the writing on the wall for Ukraine?
Unclear. I saw some reports coming out today that maybe that's a little bit more complicated than we think. And Ukraine is slightly more complicated because in light of the US being such an unreliable ally to Europe, there's an increased push for European strategic autonomy, and a lot of that is filling the gap for weapons in Ukraine. And basically all European growth at the moment is defense industries because of this increased demand from Ukraine. I think China's winning. Oil for yuan is a crazy W for China. I think the US is losing. I think the US looks weak on the world stage and is just experiencing higher oil prices because of it. I think the environment is losing. This is, the month of war has exceeded the annual carbon quota for 83 countries combined.
Wow.
And Israel, it's unclear. It also seems to me that, Zionism in terms of its ideology is one thing and does require the end of Iran. But more specifically, Benjamin Netanyahu requires a war to avoid going to prison on corruption charges. It kind of entirely unrelated to the Zionist project. He's just a corrupt politician as well as being a war criminal. So I guess he's winning as long as he's not in prison, but it's unclear that there's even enough munitions to sustain the Iron Dome for that much longer.
Well, the Iron Dome's proven it's not as successful as once thought.
Yeah.
And it's also proving, like, all this money spent on US defense, quote unquote defense, as we said last time, like $1 billion jet basically got shot down by what the US calls lawnmower drones.
Yeah.
So how much of this money is just being wasted,
Yeah. So winners, maybe China.
Yeah, China always wins.
Yeah.
To conclude, will this be one of the key chapters in U.S. imperial decline? Maybe, probably. I don't think the U.S. comes out of this with the influence they have on the world that they once had. And I think the deeper lessons here is that the point of this history isn't to excuse a brutal regime, but the point is to understand that the current war isn't about democracy or human rights. It's about oil. And it's about geopolitics. It's about 1953, when the U.S. overthrew their democratically elected leader in the first place. And it's about Israel's security calculus in all of this. It's about the fact that the U.S. keeps making the same mistake, thinking that bombs can solve political problems. Iran will not become a liberal democracy because of American bombs. It will become more nationalist, more anti-American, more determined to resist. Adam, in our first episode, you gave us this line from a Rumi poem, "Dance in the middle of the fighting." The fighting's here. We have to keep dancing, keep fighting, keep protesting, and keep trying to learn. I don't know how much of that can play an impact, but I mean, Trump's close allies are slowly falling one by one. those are a direct result of protests and trying to find scapegoats for these. So who knows? Maybe protests in this situation will work. I mean, doing nothing will be worse. So any final thoughts before we go, Adam?
The war's been going on for over a month now, war, quote unquote, and it seems like the US is no closer to any of its goals. The US has increasingly isolated itself from its allies and the toddler in charge. If he is bothered by it, he's bothered by it in a very petulant, angry way that is unlikely to win him any points. I don't think there is a clean way out of this for the United States. As you say, there's no way they come out of this with the reputation they once had. And there's no way they come out of this achieving the goals they had. And it still remains a little unclear as to what those goals were. It's looking like we might be entering a quagmire, as you say, that could go on for a long time. In the face of that, hard to know what your role is, so I would commend you on your apt summary of dance and keep protesting and keep learning.
Do it so it doesn't change us, right?
Yeah, do it so it doesn't change us. Yeah.
And we usually end with a quote, but I think we'll just leave it with that Rumi one, dance in the middle of the fighting. Thank you, dear listener, for sticking with us through this long history of a very complex country. If you enjoyed this episode, consider giving us a like, a rating, or sharing with a friend. We'll see you next time, and until then, look after each other, stay safe, and keep fighting the good fight.